Alrighty, it's 11 a.m. I think we will kick off. All right, everybody. Thank you for attending today. We know that you're all busy. The webinar is scheduled for about an hour or 60 minutes. It may finish a little early, and we know that lunch is on the other side of this webinar. So once again, thank you for attending and welcome. My name is Alexander. I'm Head of Sales at Netway Networks. And we're excited today to be hosting this webinar, discussing a topic that is very topical, to use bad English, I guess, which is cybersecurity and essential aid. So the webinar today is discussing issues around that, and hopefully you'll find this webinar informative, if not a little bit entertaining, perhaps. And on that note, we'll kick on. Before we get through our webinar, there is some housekeeping to get through. As always, the webinar is being recorded, so you can always rewatch this webinar at a later date if you like, or if you've got colleagues or friends who'd like to watch this also, please feel free to share that with them. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A button, I think somewhere down below. Feel free to use it. We'll try and answer some questions on the fly as we go through the webinar or towards the end, depending how we're doing on time. So once again, thank you, welcome, and let's get cracking. So today we're excited to have a couple of experts with us who I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to. Our first expert is a gentleman called Daniel Sparkman, and Daniel is the Technical Account Manager from Netway Networks. Daniel, could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. So, as mentioned, my name's Daniel. I am a Technical Account Manager for Netway Networks. My job revolves around improving IT footprints for new and existing clients and hoping to make meaningful change, essentially, to the way that they do business from an IT perspective.
Thanks, Daniel. And the next person we have is everyone's friend, a gentleman by the name of Leon Friend, and he's a sales engineer from ConnectWise. Leon, could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. Yeah, so as mentioned, my name's Leon. I work at ConnectWise. We're a supplier for Netway. My role as a sales engineer, for many of you may not have heard that term before, is really to help Alexander, Daniel, and the team, build out their security practice and help you build out your security postures. So, I've been doing this for, 20-something years now. So, been seeing a few different things. I've been a certification instructor, for network security and endpoint security, and done SIEM deployments, that sort of stuff. So hopefully I've got a bit of insight, not only from what discussions I've had with Daniel, but with every other partner and customer that I've had discussions with over the years.
Fantastic. I'm sure there'll be a lot of audience members that would love to pick your brain. So let's kick on again. So the first topic we have is essential aid. What is essential aid? So before we get into the discussion, we would like to engage you, the audience, and get a feel for where you guys are at on your essential aid journey. So we're about to put up a little poll, and we would be extremely grateful if you would respond. You don't have to, but if you did, that would be fantastic. So the question is where is your organisation on the essential aid journey? And the responses are either yes or no, or I don't know what essential aid is. And whilst we're waiting for some responses to come in, Daniel, have you found the marketplace regarding essential aid? Do you think a lot of people know about it?
Well, Alexander, I think the interest is growing significantly over the last, say, 5 years. Obviously, the threat landscape is growing. And every now and again, you do hear of some pretty scary leaks that have been happening, in Medicare and Uber, to name a few. So I think that's sort of driving the conversation a little bit more, and people are instinctively looking for ways to defend themselves.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. And we actually have some poll results in, and forgive me for lowering my eyes. So we've got a resounding 41% say yes, they do know what essential aid is. 27% say no, they don't know what essential, no, they don't know. And the I don't knows are in at 32. So Leon, does this sort of response surprise you at all?
Not really. I see, as Daniel mentioned, we see a lot of people are not necessarily aware of it, but there is growing awareness. So, those statistics don't surprise me. I think, having been sort of dealing around the edge of the Essential 8, actually back when it was started off as the Essential 4, back in like 2014 or something, it's grown. And the really nice thing is that it's really focused on that core fundamental capability around hardening your environment to make it secure, right? It's unfortunate that it's sort of come a bit attention because of some of those big, leaks and stuff that we've had in the last year or so. And we've seen, significant marketing drive and effort from the ACSC and the government around the context of the Essential 8 to set a baseline.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. And that's actually a good segue into our next section. But before we do that, I'd like to personally say thank you to everybody who participated in that poll. Thanks again. So based on that, Daniel, over to you. We'll start with you. Can you tell our audience what is Essential 8 and who came up with it? And what are these strategies they call Essential 8 and why are they important?
Yeah, well, let's dive right into it. And I'd be silly not to roll off the ACSC remark by Leon there. So it's the Australian Cyber Security Centre, the ACSC. Now, these are the individuals that are driving the initiative, and they're, of course, federally based. So what it is 8 mitigation strategies. So nothing too technical in this instance at a very high level. It's 8 ways that businesses can protect themselves. And it doesn't necessarily have to be large businesses. 1 all the way through to hundreds of head, no problems there. So the Essential 8 mitigation strategies. I do believe actually we have a slide floating around, and I believe we can get that one up so that I can sort of run everyone through what the Essential 8 is. And I'll just give a very brief description as to what they are and, maybe a little bit of an example. So here we go. Up on the slide, we have the Essential 8. Starting in no particular order, we have application control. So this one's a pretty important one, which means applications, what can and cannot run in your operating system. So sometimes, it could be as silly as installing Spotify. I know a lot of people love to listen to their music, but it does chew through work bandwidth. So some companies may not be inclined to host that. But in a more nefarious area, you have other applications that people might not be knowing, but they're running. So incidentally, so application control would give you some control over what applications can and cannot run. Patching applications and patching operating systems. Well, these are 2 separate mitigation strategies, but for the sake of brevity, I'll tie them together. It's basically making sure you're up to date. Now, you've probably heard that 1,000 times, and you have to reboot your computer at the end of the day and slog through those Windows updates. But I do promise you that some of those updates will be vulnerabilities that are being patched. So that's why it makes its way into our Essential 8. Next on the list, multi-factor authentication. Now, I'd bet most people know what this one is. 2 locks on a door are always going to be better than 1 lock on a door. And we've all had the text messages, here's your 6-digit code, do not share it with anyone. It's another layer of protection, a safety net, just in case your password gets leaked, which is something that obviously happens quite often. I'm a bit of a person that's guilty of this as well, where sometimes we might be inclined to use the same password. So this would help protect you against that. User application hardening. This one's a bit more complicated, but all it is when these applications that you install on your computer initially, they haven't got any configuration. And there are steps that you can take or your IT provider to make sure that those applications and their configurations are set in a way that strengthens them. And that might not always be the case if they come straight out the box. So user application hardening. Next on our list, restrict admin privileges. Well, once again, bit of a no-brainer. If you allow people to install or do anything in your environment, that's exactly what will happen. And 9 times out of 10, it'll just make housekeeping a little bit more difficult. However, if someone were to want to do something nefarious, once again, then they would have nothing stopping them from doing so if they had those admin privileges. So something to consider, who has those privileges and what can they do with them? Second last, restricting macros in Office documents. Now, this is actually quite common. And this is where we find a lot of infections take place, where someone's hidden a nasty little gremlin in a Word document or maybe an Excel spreadsheet. So something that we're all told to keep half an eye out for. And the way that we stop that is we change Outlook or Office or Excel in a way so that they can't run these macros internally. And there's also a bit of configuring you can do so you can allow some, but not others. Now, last but not least, definitely not least, is doing regular backups. And this one, once again, I'm hoping a lot of people in this webinar are already taking advantage of, mainly because it can be as simple as taking some data and putting it in a safe location. But it's just a checkpoint. In the event the wheels fall off, we really want to make sure that we have a backup of some description, which we know is safe, clean, and accessible, which we can always roll back to in the event the wheels fall off. And that's it. That is the essential 8. And just keep in the back of your mind, these are 8 ways to defend yourself from infiltrators. And that's
Fantastic. It. Thanks for that, Daniel. Leon, you mentioned earlier that the essential 8 was originally the essential 4. Which of the 8 were on the top 4 list?
Oh, honestly, it was a long time ago.
It's about 10 years, wasn't it, Leon?
Yeah, it's about 10 years
Yeah.
ago. So some of it has been divided up, and we need to remember that probably the key item here is that the essential 8 is really defined as 8 strategies that are, well, essentially essential when it comes to effectiveness in protecting your environment, right? They actually come from another a much more detailed list of strategies where there's actually about 37 of them, right? Which is strange enough called the 37 strategies to mitigate a cybersecurity incident. So what happened is all these strategies existed in that higher level document. It was just that they've recast, but some of the original ones were things like application control and the patching, right? And the admin privileges. Now, I guess that's from that point of view, that's sort of where it started. It started off really focused internally at government. And as part of government controls, they had all those other controls that they had to have, but these were the ones that they said you absolutely must meet, right? Because Daniel didn't really mention it, but the ACSC is part of the Signals Directorate, which is part of Department of Defense, which reports up to the to the minister. So yeah, that's where a lot of this actually originally came from defense, right?
Right. Yep. All good. No worries. Okay. The next section we'll move on to, I'm sure everyone is curious about, is how much does it cost to implement the essential 8? So a bit of a scenario here for you, Leon. If you were the CTO or the CIO of an organization or the IT manager, and the business came to you and said, we need to implement the essential 8, what are the sort of questions you would ask your subordinates, your employees, your organization to work out whether the essential 8 is right for your company?
Well, there's 2 sides to that, and I might get BK just to reshare that slide for a sec because I might refer to it. But the key here is understanding your risk factors and your compliance needs, right? So when I say your risk factors, because Daniel's are different to mine, for example, and really when we're going through what we do and the order we do it in and how far down the essential 8 that we go, because I don't recall Daniel mention it, but there's three maturity levels, like level 1, level 2, level 3. So as you start your journey, you're going to start and aim for level 1 maturity. And I'd say pretty much everybody, it's actually a really good thing if they aim for level 1, right? I don't think level 1 maturities really should be much of a question for anybody. But it does come down to what the compliance requirements are or the risk factors, because you must remember this is not necessarily about compliance, because the essential 8 is not necessarily regulated. It's a recommendation, right? Now, when I say compliance, it might be commercial agreements. So do you have a commercial agreement from cyber insurance or as a supplier to another customer, to one of your customers that says you must meet Essential 8 level 1, 2, or 3 compliance? We're seeing a little bit of that come through. And then I guess it's a matter of where we go from there. The other thing is, risk factors. For example, are you more concerned about having files ransomed and losing access to them, or are you more concerned about people stealing data? Those sorts of things, they can influence, the direction we take when it comes to implementing the Essential 8.
Right. You mentioned earlier, and I might throw this one over to Daniel, maturity levels 1, 2, and 3. Is that simply a case that, maturity level 1 is I've now implemented item 1 and 2, and maturity level 2 is now I've got item 1 to 4, and maturity level 3 is now ticked all 8 items. How does maturity level just work, Daniel, on a very, quick description?
Yeah, well, just to sort of break it down in a very quick and easy way, the maturity levels actually start with 0, which is, we're not really doing anything to mitigate these risks. And if you want to excel through your maturity levels, you have to tick off what's called an ITSM control. And it's basically a checklist of things that you're doing to defend yourself. And this information is readily available from the ACSC website. It'll tell you exactly what you need to check off the list to reach those maturity levels. And I can assure you, your cyber insurance mob will be very interested to hear on how you score against those maturity levels.
Fantastic.
What I might add is that the maturity levels, to get level 1 maturity, you actually have to cover all of these 8 strategies. It's not just like, how you ask whether it's 1 or 2 of them. It's more about the depth. So remember, we talk about, in security, we talk about defense in depth all the time, right? So what we talk about essentially the maturity levels is depth. So level 1s are fairly, may not necessarily require a lot of extra tools. It's just about policy work and tidying up and making sure everything's understood. And then as we go through, even to hit level 2 and level 3 maturities, there's reporting requirements to the ACSC and the Privacy Commission, and all this sort of stuff can come into play. So,
fantastic. Thanks for that, gents. Before we move into our next section of the webinar, I'd like to remind everybody or our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and use the Q&A button, because we certainly look forward to answering most of your questions. And I'm sure there is stuff that, we'll discuss today that we haven't thought of that is relevant to your business. So moving right along, we would like to test where the audience is at again. We have another poll right now. And again, most of you might be CIOs or IT managers in our audience. And that next question really is about cybersecurity budgets. So how many organizations in our audience have a separate cybersecurity budget to their IT budget? So we're dealing with the IT budget and a cybersecurity budget as 2 separate entities. So again, as before, your answers are fairly simple. It's either a yes or a no, or I don't know. And perhaps whilst we're waiting for some responses to come in, Leon, just I guess, a question from myself. If I implement the 8 essential 8, I guess, do I get the men in black coming knocking on my door, making sure that they can audit this stuff every year, or am I handing my information to some suits who are going to hold me responsible for it?
So, I mean, the short answer is that's not the intent, right? The Essential 8 is not regulated in the form of you must do it from a government regulation point of view. So the men in black really aren't necessarily there. What I will say is that there is a number of things here, and it's with the Essential 8, you're not sharing information externally. It's all about how you're securing your environment. And really the point here is it's about trying to protect yourself, right? So you're doing some fundamental things to protect your own business and your customers. And what we're trying to secure with the Essential 8 could be described as the engine of your economy. So the things that actually make your business function, right? If you lost access to that resource, that server, that file, what impact would it have on your business? So we're trying to mitigate that. So what that means is that it's really not around men in black and I'm meeting compliance. It's about your best effort. Now, going through the Essential 8 process does is demonstrates that you're trying to protect yourself. You're leveraging a known framework as a starting point, right? And I say starting point because the Essential 8, very well could be the starting point, right? I mentioned, the 37 strategies. Daniel mentioned the ITSM, which is above that, which is even more expansive. We have other security frameworks. The point is essentially it's about the fundamental, getting your baseline right, making sure your environment's tidy, and that you're doing you've established that you need to protect yourself and you're doing something about it. We've even seen cases where businesses have been taken to court, the federal court, by ASIC because they were seen not to be doing this, right? And they had significant breaches ongoing. So the ASIC took them to court, and the business's position was, well, I can't protect myself against cybersecurity incidents, so I'm not going to try. And they took them to court, and but effectively the court came back and said, no, you have to do your best to protect yourself, right? And as part of that judgment, we saw comments from the commissioner of the ASIC sort of say the Essential 8 is a really good baseline and a really good starting point.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Leon. So we have our poll results in. So Razandi, 11% say yes, they do have a separate cybersecurity budget. 67% of our audience have actually said no, they don't. And 22% have said, I don't know. So again, thank you for responding to our poll. We really appreciate that. So just very quickly, gents, because time is ticking. One of the obvious questions, I guess, our audience might have, and I certainly, I know I do, and Leon, I'll throw this over to you.
Sure.
When implementing the Essential 8, which of those 8 strategies would you say is the most expensive?
Okay, this might sound strange, but when we talk about level 1 maturity, your biggest expense is probably in time and effort, right? Because you may actually have the majority of the tools that you already need. You just don't necessarily know it. And part of this is that building the policies and procedures around what you do. So, I could ask the questions around, how many of you have, acceptable internet usage policies? How many of you have, BYD policies, all these sorts of policies and procedures, because they define it and they support what we do with the Essential 8. Culturally, and Daniel mentioned a couple, but there's, if we look at things like administrative privileges, culturally, most businesses allow their staff to just have local admin privileges, which means they can do whatever they like, right? When they do that, flip side is under the application control, they can install any application they like, right? So your medical business, for argument's sake, and a guy could install some DJI software for managing his drone, right? And then it's like, well, why did he do that? Because we don't use drones in the office, right? But likewise, if we allow them to access things like personal email, which is part of the the user application hardening, it's like we've seen things like Ferrari where people have, a design engineer at Ferrari accessed his personal email, actually had malware delivered to him by that, and then they ended up with designs being stolen, right? The F1 Formula cars. So, or data can get out of the business, because remember, this is not necessarily about malware. It's also about what data you have and protect the data. So if we allow things like device control and people to use USB sticks, that's what happens there. So the biggest cost with the Essential 8 is often cultural. Right, so it's not necessarily dollars and cents. It's, from the top down, the business must go, I need to have a security focus, and I need to make sure I'm paying attention to all these items, because any one of these ones, can result in, not meeting these compliances, but open up the business to risk. And if to give you the example, I mentioned the DJI one, but that's the admin rights, but that comes into the application control, because now we have software that we've not assured and decided that we want to allow in our business there and running, right? Which means that we no longer have visibility or have an understanding of what applications we need to patch.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So see how each of these strategies actually support each other, which is why you've got to do all 8 of them. And you've got to meet like level 1 on all 8 of them before you can start to structurally consider being compliant at level 2, for example.
Fair enough. Thanks for that, Leon. Appreciate it so much. And just very quickly, Daniel, I'll throw over to you. Of the 8, what do you think would be the least expensive?
Well, as far as expense goes, Leon's comment nailed it, where, it doesn't really cost anything to take an interest in your security. So if you're looking for something that's not going to cost you any cash at all, one of my preferred go-tos would be most likely the backup scenario. So I will reiterate, these mitigation strategies are like a fabric where they always work much better, and they're intended to work together to form a fabric instead of just a loose thread. But to answer your question, I'd have to say backups. Not to take the thunder away from the other 7, but if you have a checkpoint in time that you can go back to, it's not a case of, well, if something bad goes wrong, everything's out the window, which unfortunately is the case for a lot of individuals. And the cost is extremely low to get a hard drive or a USB, or just find a safe place for your information.
Well, and to add to that, most people already have backups. So it's more about what we're doing and making sure we have the right policies in place. Because I know
and validating those backups.
Most people like yourselves, Alexander and Daniel, have been doing backups for your customers for years, right? And you got that down pat. Usually what happens with the Essential 8 is that your backups are not considered compliant with the Essential 8 just because the businesses don't have policies and procedures and haven't identified what they need backed up. So again, to Daniel's point, to get Essential 8 compliance, most of the time it's about tidying up that policy to say, yeah, we need to back up these, we need to be able to restore them in whatever time frames and all this sort of fun stuff.
Yeah, asking the hard questions.
Fair enough. All right. And that leads us into our next section, actually, which is a good segue, which is one strategy. So playing devil's advocate here with and our audience listening, if they or we had to choose one strategy, so 1 out of 8, Daniel, which one would you recommend?
Well, I mean, it's like picking a favorite child, right? And I get in trouble for not choosing the other ones. But one defense strategy I find, which is a high yield, low investment, is your multi-factor authentication. And it is a real pain for some people. I always have the joke when they say, I don't want to put my code in and I don't want to have to hit the green tick. Well, I respond with, well, I don't want to lock my front door at night because it takes me 30 seconds to get my keys out of my pocket. But I do sleep a lot better at night knowing that my front door is locked. So MFA is not something that we should be going without in 2024. That would have to be my choice, but only by a slim margin.
Fair enough. And Leon, over to you. In all your years of expertise, again, in this scenario, if you could only pick one strategy out of 8, which one would you pick?
So hard. I might just support Daniel's example though for a second before I sort of comment on what I might do. But the reality is that the MFA, the things that make that so important is we see so many breaches and so many published usernames and passwords on the dark web that MFA can save so many people so much pain, right? And to give a little bit of an example on this, there was last Christmas, there was actually what we call a credential stuffing attack on PayPal. We're all familiar with PayPal. Many people use PayPal to pay for stuff on the internet. It actually turned out to be largely a non-event because 99% of users had MFA turned on, right? So credential stuffing attack is people had on the dark web, they got a list of usernames and passwords, and they just went and smash PayPal with those combinations. Anybody that didn't have MFA, they got access to, right? So, that's the sort of reason we talk about MFA all the time. And then there's different levels of MFA. We've seen a huge improvement with MFA. Generally recommend you stay away from SMS because we do see things like SIM swapping and all that sort of stuff. But you'll see that in the Essential 8, they too talk about phishing resistant MFA, which is things like applications with push codes and all that sort of stuff, fun stuff, right? Having said that, I think I'm gonna cheat and actually probably lump 2 together, and that's the patching, right?
Okay.
So when I'm lumping the 2 together, that's the patch operating systems and patch applications. Now, The reason I say that is we've even seen, overnight, for example, we've seen a report where there's actors on the black market that are out there selling remote access to 3,000 Juniper SSL VPN devices, right? They got that access because there was a patch available and those appliances weren't patched. We've seen stats that sort of say most malware gets a foothold through a vulnerability in a piece of software, whether it be at the OS level or the application level. And the reality is most people, there's a lot of patches that have been out there for 18 months that still haven't been applied to environments. Right.
That's a little bit beyond everyone's control though, right, Leon? I mean, you buy a device, you're not really in control of the software updates as such.
Yeah, you are. The patches are out there, they're available. You need to push them in. If you got a personal computer, Windows updates telling you to reboot and download them. We don't want to disable that functionality. In the business environment, we want to control that more tightly. But to your point, it's like, if we talk about patching and layer into the OS side of it, one of the things about patching is making sure we're running on commercially available or readily available supported software. So whether that's a currently supported version Windows or a currently supported application. So for example, if you've got Adobe Flash in your network, you're in a heap of trouble, right? It's been discontinued for probably 10 years. There's thousands of known vulnerabilities in it. If you've got it there, you're just an open target. We see the same in business. The biggest risk is a lot of people go, no, I really like my Windows Millennium, my Windows 98. I don't want to change. The reality is they're leaving themselves wide open. So they're making, in that scenario, you'll make a decision not to maintain your environment. And what we're saying here is you need to maintain your environment. And that means upgrading to Windows 10, to Windows 11, while before you lose support on the one that you're currently on.
Right. All right. Well, that brings us to our next section, actually, or next few questions, which I'm sure everyone is wondering. So if I'm on this journey, I'm sitting in this webinar, I've listened to what both of you gentlemen have had to say. Where do I go? Where do I start with implementing Essential 8? Do I download a checklist and sit there and tick them off? Do I go to an outside organisation and get some professional help outside? What do I do?
It can be quite complicated, and I always like to say, if you want to understand where you're going, you have to understand where you are, right? So that's when the roadmap sort of comes into place. And as Leon stated before, there is a lot of different aspects to this, and knowing how well you're doing something currently will help answer that question on what I need to improve.
Yes,
So,
but sorry, Daniel, do I use an outsourced company to do my Essential 8, or do I do it myself?
yeah, of course. Well, there are assessment tools made available by the ACSC, but honestly, the best way you can go forward is with a technical consultation. So these are the type of things that I would do with my clients, existing and new. And I do offer consultations up to 30 minutes. And we have a very high level discussion about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then we can derive ways to move forward just from a simple conversation.
Fair enough. And Leon, again, in your expertise, you're obviously the subject matter expert here, as well as Daniel, of course. Would you advise our audience to do this themselves, or would they go to a certified managed services company to do their Essential 8?
So I would normally advise that they talk to a trusted party like yourselves, a managed service provider. The reality is, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with this, is that as a business owner, as a manager in your business, you are a specialist in the business that you run, right? What that means is that you're not familiar with cybersecurity. Daniel and I talk about and live cybersecurity every day, and we don't know everything. One of our major roles is education. So hence we're doing this webinar today, is to help you understand a little bit about it so you can go in the right direction. So you can, as Daniel said, you go onto the ACSC website. They have a word template. It's like a checklist, all this sort of stuff. You can go through that. The reality is you probably won't know most of the answers. because you won't understand the questions. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is just where you are, right? So leverage people around you that you trust as a resource. Now, you may have an internal IT guy that actually understands it, can go through that, then that's fine. But even an IT guy doesn't necessarily understand the security implications of some things, right? Because most IT guys have, and again, this is their role. There's nothing wrong with this. Their focus is on maintaining operation and making sure things work, right? Not necessarily thinking about securing it. So that's why I would actually recommend that they engage with somebody like Daniel or their trusted service provider or a trusted advisor, a trusted consultant, whoever it might be, that understands cybersecurity, understands what the Essential 8 is, and then can go through that with them, help them understand their risk factors, which will help them understand where they need to aim, whether it be level 1, level 2, level 3.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Leon. Appreciate it. And now we get to the fun part of the Q&A. I certainly think it's fun, which is the live question and answers. And as I said earlier at the beginning of this webinar, we certainly invite questions from you, the audience, because, again, looking at technical things through technical eyes, we don't always see things the way that other people do. So please, if you have any questions, shoot them through. I know Daniel and Leon are looking forward to answering your questions. And as Leon said, the whole purpose of the webinar is to educate you, our audience, about Essential 8. Whilst we're waiting for some questions to come in, Leon, I have a question for you. I know years ago, the biggest security threat to any organisation was usually from inside. Has that changed now? Has the table turned that your biggest security threat is now from the outside?
I guess technically true. The biggest threat is from the outside. But usually the foothold and the entry point is somebody inside your business doing something. And and this is where I get a bit cautious, because when we talk about insider threat, so many people go to somebody is being, is out, inside my organization is going out of their way to harm my business. And that's not true, right? I think we saw the numbers, something like 80% of breaches can be attributed to human error in one form or another. And usually that's a user that has clicked on an email link thinking it was from your supplier or from a customer, trying to do the right thing to support your customers. So yes, the cause is the end, the initial point of entry is often one of your an insider threat from the point of view of somebody has clicked on something, but it's actually caused by an external factor.
Right. And quickly, Daniel, what's your opinion on this? Do you think, cybersecurity threats are more inside or outside an organisation?
I like to try and put myself in the shoes of the infiltrator, and there's a couple of powerful motivators to want to do something naughty like this, and that's obviously money, right? Whether or not it's just to extort you out of money via crypto or to sell your intellectual property, which would then technically mean that it's coming from an external entity. And just to back up Leon's comment there, about 80% of these infiltrations happen via email, right? So very important to have a spam filter if you don't have one. But yeah, it would come from an external entity. It would find its way in one way or another, most likely via email. And that's exactly correct, where people don't understand what they're doing, clicking on the wrong thing. And it's up for their internal or external IT to spot, mitigate, and then make sure it doesn't happen again.
Right. Thanks for that. And we have a question from Mark. And Mark, thank you for your question. Leon, I might hand this over to you. How should I respond in the event of an incident, a cyber breach? What should I do? So,
I mean, the short answer is go to your incident response plan. Go to your predefined process. Having said that, I know most of you probably don't have one. Because it really, depending on what the incident is and what it involves, it really means different things. Because you need to think about, when something happens, who am I going to reach out to? Of course, a garbage truck just pulled up. Who are you going to talk to? Do you need to tell your customers? Do you need to tell your staff? Do you need to report it to the ACSC or the Privacy Commissioner? You need to understand all these things and build out your incident response plan. So my short answer is go to your incident response plan. And Daniel and Alexander's team can help you build that out if you don't already have one. right? Because I recognize most, particularly in small businesses, you don't have one. They don't have to be complicated, but you need to have something. You need to know who's going to talk about what, who's going to do what, who's going to call who, right? And then you can go from there. And every time you have something happen, you'll follow that plan, and then after you've gone through it, you'll revisit it and tweak it, because everything's changing all the time.
Fantastic.
That might sound like a cop out, but that's what I would do.
No, fair enough. You're the expert. We have a question here from Con, and Con, if you're watching, thanks very much for your question. And this is a really good, simple question, actually. What's a good antivirus? What should I use? Daniel, Leon?
I necessarily wouldn't go straight for an antivirus, and I won't get too technical here, but antiviruses are definition based. So it's sort of like going to the doctor once you're already sick. So although they are important and we still use them, there's another slice of technology that has made its way into our tech stack, and that is an EDR. EDR stands for Endpoint Detect and Response. And without going into too much detail, it's an application that runs on your computer. And every time you go to do something, it'll put a little blast chamber around that process or file. So if something were to happen, like it were to explode inside your computer and black smoke would pour out, well, it would be contained within that blast chamber. Now, the end user doesn't even notice that this is happening, and it can be vital in stopping crypto lockers before they get a foothold in your computer. So very similar to an antivirus, but we call it an EDR. And to give you a brand, one of my preferred brands that I go for is CrowdStrike. It's one of the industry leaders, particularly here in Australia. And the service and support that you can get from this mob is, is unparalleled. It's fantastic.
Fantastic.
I might just add to that, like one of the
please
really important things about EDR, is, and to oversimplify it, it's like, many people sort of think of, antivirus on steroids, because it is, it's focused on dealing with the unknowns rather than knowns, whereas antivirus is very focused on what it knows, right? But also, as we're going through that incident response and an investigation, EDR provides that high fidelity information around what's happened. So it can help you decide whether you need to do a notification to the Privacy Commissioner, because you can see what files were touched, those sorts of things. Whereas traditional antivirus, it would just say, hey, I caught something and I did a good job and I caught it and cleaned it up, and you don't necessarily know what it did.
Fair enough. All right, gentlemen. Leon, I've got a question for you. An audience member has sent this through. You mentioned depth in maturity levels earlier. Can you provide an example of depth of maturity level 1 to maturity level 3?
So generally, you could probably think of level 1 maturity as being primarily policy work around making sure everything's tight and tidy, right? So that you're eliminating any of those key risk factors. As you hit level 2 and level 3 maturity, you need to start to have things like in your business organization, such as a CISO, so Security Information Security Officer. You need to have reporting mechanisms. You probably need additional tools like SIEMs and those sorts of things. So again, start with level 1, understand your risk factors, and then you can work through the rest of it. Because we talked about cost earlier. The cost of doing level 1 maturity is not necessarily high, right? But as we hit level 2 and level 3, that is where you're more likely to need to add, actual software, additional software and tooling into your environment, and have additional, human, resource requirements around CISOs and, the ability to respond, who's going to communicate, who the lawyers are, all these sorts of things. So that's probably the primary area.
Fantastic. Sorry, Leon.
I'd focus on level 1 to start with.
I'll cut you off there, if you don't mind. We have another question that's come through from, and I'm going to apologise up front, Yezi, if you're watching, I do apologise. And it's a great question, actually. We mentioned earlier about organisations having separate budgets, and this question is about that. What is a reasonable percentage of budget that should be allocated to cybersecurity out of an IT budget? And I'll throw this to both of you.
I might jump in real quick if I may, because I do like this question, and it's a practical question, right? With my clients, and this is just a rule of thumb, I'd like to estimate between 10 to 50 seats. I would say 25%, about a quarter. Now, do keep in mind that that has to include your backup scheduling. So, paying for a place to store that data, and as well the licensing associated with your defensive tools. So as Leon said, as you climb in those maturity levels, so too does the tools in your tool belt. To give you a number straight up, I'd say 25%. If you're spending more on 365 licensing than you are on your cybersecurity, I would potentially reevaluate.
And Leon, what would your percentage be?
Look, I probably approach it slightly differently. I think the band there that Daniel mentioned is pretty good. What I just sort of flagged though is that you may actually, some of this might be you're already spending the money and you haven't even thought about it, because you may already be spending money on backups. If you've already got business premium on your Office 365 or E5 licenses, then you've already got some stuff in there that can help you do this, right? So some of it may be reallocation of existing budget to be clear. But really what you need to do is start off with understanding your risk factors, because the higher you consider your risk factor, the higher that percentage will be, right? So if you're more worried about people hacking and stealing data and all that sort of stuff, you'll need to spend more than if you're just worried about getting a ransomware event, if that makes sense.
Yep, definitely. And another question that's come through, which is actually quite a good question. So if I implement Essential 8, do I now just forget about it, or is it something that I need to review annually?
We both had to have a smile on that one. Absolutely not. It's kind of like saying, well, I drank a glass of water today, so I don't need to, worry about my health moving forwards. It's a journey, and those journeys are comprised of little steps every day. So to sort of go back on a statement from earlier, it doesn't cost anything except for your time to take an interest. And it's definitely something that you're going to be revisiting weekly to make sure that you're tracking. And obviously those policies that Leon has mentioned, making sure that they're up to date, they're followed, and that they're practical. So every day is a day for security.
Fantastic. Daniel, earlier you mentioned about, and my memory is a bit foggy, you mentioned a 30-minute discussion. Can you tell our audience members how they book that, and is there a cost associated with that?
Yeah, so straight up, there's no cost associated with it. And it's normally reserved for my existing clients, but I happily extend the invitation to anyone and everyone who wants to take an interest in their security. The best ways to contact is I can make my email readily available, and I have a little link that you can click in and book a 30-minute consultation with me. So we'll get that link out as well as my email. Plus, you've got the Netway website. So if you can remember the name, Netway Networks, you can jump straight onto our website, and there's a little blurb just there. You can throw your details in, and you can say, hey, I was promised a 30-minute chat with Dan, and I'd love to take him up on that offer. We'll get you booked in, and we can have a high-level chat.
Fantastic. And if anybody knows Daniel, he does love to chat. Leon, the next question's over to you. And Valentine, if you're watching, thank you very much for your question. We really, really, really appreciate it. So, Leon, the question is, you mentioned Flash 98 XP being a danger. How can these be a threat when they haven't got through your firewall? Or does this apply to devices directly connected to the internet?
Okay. If the device is connected to your network, it's a risk, right? The reality is, I think I mentioned a scenario with Ferrari. If we have, if you give them internet access and they can access their personal email or they can access websites, they could be at risk. From an endpoint protection point of view, historically you've been as but they don't download files from the internet. The reality is there are we're seeing a huge explosion in the amount of fileless malware out there, which just means you need to visit a website to get malware, infection onto your computer, right? So the software there is not supported by the vendor. There are no patches. There's no way to fix those vulnerabilities, which means you're just at risk, right? Because I think I mentioned the 18-month sort of number. You know, it's like if you have a version of Microsoft Office that's 18 months old and you haven't patched it, you know, there's going to be thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities there that Microsoft have addressed, they've patched. So if you're up to date, it wouldn't be a risk. You know, we even seen incidents where, you know, we talk about 0 days because the biggest risk in security is a 0 day. That's where a malicious actor knows, found a vulnerability and can hit it before the software vendor can do anything about it, right? The inverse is true. I saw a piece of software that had a major vulnerability. It was published at like 9 a.m. in the morning. And on the dark web, there was about 400 attack execution pieces of code sitting there ready for people to use. Right. And that's in a matter of an hour or two. So, you know, think of, you know, then go back to some piece of software that's 10 years old.
And just to add on to the end of that, Leon, a lot of these people have no intention of using the tools, but selling the tools, right? They're not the ones that want to get their hands dirty. So once they develop, you know, the tools needed to exploit that vulnerability, they just hand it over to the criminals and say, you know, you give me my Bitcoin and I'll be on my way.
And we mentioned phishing emails earlier. You know, they only need less than 1% of people to click on that email to actually, you know, get a return on investment because it's highly automated.
So I guess in summary, I remember years ago when I was doing networks, which I don't do anymore, you know, your firewall was the be all and end all. But these days it's that literally anything that's connected to the internet going through your firewall is basically a risk.
Yeah, and you know, you have control over everything in your network, is the other side of it. We've seen, you know, a couple of years back, the largest distributed denial of service attack we ever saw was from IP security cameras that were inside people's networks. Right. So, you know, some of this comes to you because I used to teach people how to install like enterprise grade firewalls, you know, the checkpoints of the world and stuff. And yeah, network segmentation and all those sort of things are really useful. But at the end of the day, if somebody can access the internet or a device in your network can access the internet, then having that old hard software OS application is a risk.
Yeah, actually that's a very good point, Leon. So things like IP cameras, even I think I read somewhere that even as mundane as they are, printers are even vulnerable.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Printers have been a major attack vector. There was it came out, it turned out to be not quite right, that somebody was misquoted, but there was actually a quote from Europe earlier this year where there was discussions around how they thought a large denial of service attack may have been generated by internet connected toothbrushes.
Fair enough. All right, gents, we've got another question that's come through. We've got a couple actually. Determining compliance level against Essential 8. Does the ACSC have any interactive tools? So far, we've only found a downloadable document checklist, and there's no estimators. So are there any interactive tools that we can download to check our Essential 8 compliance?
No, I mean, part of that is the complexity of the policies and things. So that's why somebody like Daniel can help you out. Whether you want to hit level 1, level 2, level 3, you know, the ACSC that on there, they talk about the risk factors for each maturity level. So they sort of describe some of the key decision process it might have around which one you want to aim for. But yeah, it's unfortunately at the moment, yeah, there are some ways to do some fundamental checks, but depending on how you go about implementing it and what your end goal and what your risk factors are, it can be really hard. But what I'll say is, if we compare to say, because I can actually see one of the other questions, Alexander, is about ISO 27001 and the Essential 8. It's like the Essential 8 is real key fundamental stuff. It does map up to other things like ISO 27001. When you get up to those high levels, they are very granular, and then it becomes much easier to do that automatic mapping and stuff, because it's like I have this one item that does this one thing, right? Whereas the Essential 8's a little bit more holistic than that.
Fair enough. Leon, this question actually I think is right in your ballpark that we've got come through. So we have a audience member who's currently looking to satisfy as many Essential 8 criteria as possible. They're currently looking at Threat Locker.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts about Threat Locker?
So what I'll say is that Threat Locker is a really common, effective tool for doing application control, right? I know many business users it, probably more use it than any of the other ones that I talk to. Okay. But again, you know, it can actually be, so it's probably one of the best tools around particularly for smaller businesses, right?
Fair enough. Daniel, sorry, Leon. Daniel, do you have an opinion on that?
I just wanted to add on the end there that Threat Locker as a tool is extremely valuable to a company, but it does derive its value from how well it's set up, right? And
That's
then
what I was about to
maintaining
say.
that, yeah, because the landscape changes, applications changes, things need updating, people leave, people join, and if you're not taking those into consideration with Threat Locker, it's not going to go anywhere. So although getting that in your tool belt is what you want, you do need to use the tools that you've now invested in, either yourself or a nominated party.
Yeah, because it's really good at defining exactly what apps they can use, what those apps can do, how the users can use them. But
You
if you
just gotta
don't have
tell
the
it.
policies and the framework around how to define that and how to do that, then it's going to be very hard. If you're talking about level 2 or level 3 maturity, you need something like Threat Locker.
Absolutely.
Level 1, it makes your life so much easier to get level 1, don't get me wrong, but you can sort of do level 1 without it. But yeah, it's definitely worthwhile. But honestly, we talked about costs earlier, and I said cultural. One of the biggest challenges, like in the overall everything sort of scheme, the hardest one, not necessarily the most expensive one, but the hardest one is application control. But it is also the most effective one, right? So if you get it right, yeah. Threat Locker, for example, won't allow unapproved code to execute on your endpoint. That means malware can't execute on your endpoint, right? But you can end up in it can be very painful to start with because there's possibly all these applications you don't know about and you haven't thought about that you end up blocking.
Fair enough. Well, I'm being given the nod. It's time to close up, and that's a wrap, as they say in the business. I would like to personally thank everybody who's taken the time to attend today. I've been your host, Alexander. You'll receive a short survey after the webinar, and we would really appreciate if you could answer the survey and let us know how we went. And that sort of feedback is extremely useful. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop us an email or a message. And the email address is info@netway.net.au. And as soon as we receive the email, I'm sure that my colleagues will reach out to you and respond to anything that you would like to ask. A recording of the webinar will be shared in a post after this session. You'll be sent an email link that we spoke about those earlier. You'll be sent an email link where you can actually look at the recording and watch it again. So once again, on behalf of myself, Daniel, Leon, thank you again for your time, and also yourself, Daniel. Thank you guys for attending. Our audience, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your day. I know everyone's keen to get to lunch. I know I am. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
No worries. You're more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.